Hercule Poirot observed the man before him with keen interest. Dr. Leonard Graves, a physician in his late 40s, sat rigidly, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair as though to steady himself. He was a tall man, lean to the point of gauntness, with deep-set eyes that flickered with unease. His lips trembled before he spoke, his voice hushed yet strained. "Monsieur Poirot, I hardly know where to begin." Poirot, ever patient, tilted his head. "The beginning, doctor, is always a most excellent place." Graves exhaled sharply. "It is my wife. She has been dead for 14 months now." His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. At first it was nothing but whispers, averted gazes, then the letters came. Accusations scrawled in cruel anonymous hands. "They say I killed her, that I poisoned her." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And did you?" Graves' eyes flashed with fury as he shot to his feet. Poirot merely gestured for him to sit. "Calm yourself, doctor. I merely ask what others believe." Graves sank back into his seat, his face drawn. "I loved my wife, Monsieur Poirot. She was ill for years, but I did not hasten her end." His voice cracked. "Yet the whole town has turned against me. Patients avoid me. My practice is crumbling. Even my closest friends hesitate to meet my gaze. It is as if an invisible noose is tightening around my neck. A sentence already passed without a trial." Poirot steepled his fingers, considering the man carefully. "And tell me, doctor, did your wife die naturally, or was there something unusual about her passing?" A shudder ran through Graves' frame. He hesitated, and for the first time Poirot detected something deeper in his expression. Was it fear, or something else entirely? Poirot studied Dr. Leonard Graves with an expression of quiet contemplation, his fingers resting lightly against his lips. The man before him sat slumped in the chair, his once proud shoulders now sagging beneath an invisible weight, his hands pale and trembling clenched into fists against his knees. "Monsieur Poirot," Graves began hoarsely, "I have come to you because I am being destroyed, slowly, mercilessly." His voice, though steady, carried the unmistakable tremor of desperation. Poirot inclined his head. "Ah, yes, the whisper of suspicion. It slithers like a serpent, tightening ever so gradually until one cannot breathe." Graves exhaled sharply, nodding. "It started as mere gossip. My wife passed away 14 months ago, and at first there were only murmurs, casual, meaningless, but they grew, they spread. Now they coil around me like a living thing, suffocating my existence." He swallowed hard, his fingers twitching. "Everywhere I go I see the whispers forming on people's lips before they even speak. They think I killed her, that I poisoned her." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "And did you?" Graves flinched, his face paling, but Poirot merely lifted a hand. "A simple question, doctor. You see, rumor is the Hydra of Lernean. You cut off one head, and 2 more take its place. The only way to destroy it is to strike at its heart. And so tell me, what was the cause of death?" Graves hesitated. "Gastric complications. She had suffered for years." Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. "No autopsy." A pause. "No, it was deemed unnecessary." "I see," Poirot murmured. "And you inherited from her?" Graves stiffened. "Yes, around £40,000. Poirot's brows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Instead he leaned forward, his voice a mere whisper. "And tell me, doctor, what was your marriage like? No quarrels? No discord?" Graves' jaw tightened. "We had our struggles. My wife was a difficult woman, often ill, often demanding, but I cared for her. I did my duty." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "And yet, duty is not always love, is it?" Graves flinched again, and for the first time something flickered behind his eyes. Was it guilt, or merely the exhaustion of a man drowning in the weight of unseen enemies? Poirot's voice softened, but there was an unmistakable sharpness beneath it. "Dr. Graves, if you did not kill your wife, then someone somewhere wants the world to believe that you did, and that, mon ami, is the mystery we must solve." Poirot studied Dr. Leonard Graves with a knowing gaze, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest of his chair. The doctor sat stiffly, his expression carefully composed, yet beneath the surface, Poirot detected something: discomfort, perhaps even fear. Your wife, Poirot mused, was she of a nervous disposition, prone to bouts of melancholy, a woman who felt unappreciated, neglected? Graves' jaw tightened. She was often unwell, and yes, at times she was difficult. Poirot gave a small nod, his voice gentle but unwavering. Ah yes, I have encountered such women before. They convince themselves that they are a burden, that their husband has grown weary of them, that he would perhaps be relieved, if not eager, for their suffering to end. A flicker of something crossed Graves' face, and Poirot knew he had struck a... She said such things, didn't she, Doctor? Graves hesitated. Then reluctantly he sighed. Yes, she did. Poirot leaned forward. And tell me, did she have a nurse, a companion, someone close enough to observe your marriage, to form opinions? Graves shifted in his seat. She had a nurse companion, a capable woman, efficient. Poirot's smile was faint but knowing, capable, and talkative. Graves shook his head. I don't believe she would gossip. Poirot raised a brow. Ah, Doctor, even the most discreet have their moments. The whispers began somewhere. None. The nurse, the servants, the townspeople, all eager for a story, all weaving their own version of events, and rumors, mon cher, are like a fire in dry grass. They spread swiftly, consuming everything in their path. Poirot paused, his gaze now sharper. But there is one question left And tell me, Doctor, who is the woman? A stunned silence followed. Graves blinked, his lips parting slightly.
My what?
The woman, Poirot repeated, his voice now soft, almost amused. The one they whisper about, the one whose name is coupled with yours in hushed voices, the one they say was your reason. Graves shot to his feet, his face taut with anger. There is no woman. Poirot merely studied him, calm and unmoved. No, none. Graves insisted, his fists clenching at his sides. Poirot sighed. A pity. Without the truth I cannot help you. Graves hesitated, his entire frame rigid. Poirot waited, watching. Then just as the doctor turned toward the door, Poirot spoke again, low, deliberate. Doctor, the village gossip, it always centers around one thing, the relations between a man and a woman. If a husband is accused of poisoning his wife, there is always a woman at the heart of the tale. Graves froze. Poirot smiled slightly. Now, shall we start again? Poirot tapped his fingers rhythmically against the polished desk, his keen gaze never leaving Dr. Leonard Graves. The doctor had slumped back into his seat, his face lined with tension, his breath uneven. He had thought himself prepared for this conversation, but Poirot had peeled away his defenses with surgical precision. The detective leaned forward, his voice quiet, yet insistent. Doctor, I will tell you something. A man may leave his wife for solitude, for adventure, or even for the icy desolation of the North Pole, and the world will not care. But if a wife dies under suspicious circumstances, and there is another woman, that is when the whispers begin, when the fire spreads. Graves exhaled sharply, his lips pressing into a thin line. I am not responsible for the vicious gossip of a small-minded town. Poirot gave a slight nod. Perhaps not, but you are entangled in it nonetheless. And if we are to untangle the threads, I must ask you again, Doctor, who is the woman? Graves hesitated, then sighed, his fingers tightening on the arms of his chair. If they've been talking about anyone, it's probably Miss Reynolds. Claire Reynolds is my assistant, a capable, intelligent woman. Poirot's brows lifted slightly. How long has she worked for you? 4 years. And your wife, did she like her? A flicker of discomfort crossed Graves' face. She was irrationally suspicious. She thought Claire had too much influence over my practice, over me. It was absurd. Poirot tilted his head, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. Ah, yes, the jealousy of a wife, it is as old as time. But I will tell you something, Doctor. In my experience, no matter how unreasonable jealousy may seem, it is very rarely without foundation. Graves scoffed. That's ridiculous. I never said or did anything inappropriate. My wife could have overheard every word I ever spoke to Claire. Poirot leaned in, his eyes gleaming with sharp intensity. Perhaps, but it does not change the truth of what I said. A woman's instincts, how shall I say, they rarely lie. Graves shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Poirot's voice lowered, but the force behind it was undeniable. Dr. Graves, I intend to help you, but to do so, I need absolute honesty. No half-truths, no carefully constructed defenses. You must tell me everything. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Graves swallowed hard, and for the first time, Poirot saw it. Hesitation, something just beneath the surface, a secret waiting to be uncovered. Poirot smiled faintly. Shall we begin again, mon ami? The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as Dr. Jonathan Hale leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. Across from him, the world-renowned detective, Alistair Durant, sat perfectly still, his sharp gaze fixed on the doctor's pale, drawn face. Tell me, Doctor, Durant murmured, his voice like a blade slicing through the tension. It is true, is it not, that your feelings for your wife had faded long before she died? Hale's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching slightly. This entire situation is suffocating me, he admitted. Everywhere I go, I hear the whispers, see the wary glances. My patients have dwindled, my reputation is crumbling, and yet, I know the truth doesn't matter to them. They believe what they want to believe. Durant nodded slowly. And what is the truth? A pause. Then, as if surrendering, Hale exhaled sharply. No, I did not love my wife. Not for a long time. I provided for her, cared for her, but no. His voice faltered for a moment, before he continued, quieter this time. And Claire? The question hung in the air like a noose tightening. A fine sheen of perspiration broke out across Hale's forehead. I would have asked her to marry me by now, if not for this nightmare. Durant leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. At last we arrive at the truth, he said, almost pleasantly. Dr. Hale, I will take your case, but know this, I seek only the truth, no matter where it leads. Hale gave a short, bitter laugh. The truth. He shook his head. It isn't the truth that's destroying me, Durant. It's the lies, the whispers in the dark, the unseen accusations. He hesitated, before voicing the thought that had gnawed at him for weeks. I've considered taking legal action, slander, defamation, something to force the people to show their faces, to confront their accusations. But would that really silence them, or would it only pour fuel on the fire? His voice dropped to a whisper. Is there any way out of this? Durant's gaze was steady, unyielding. There is always a way out, Doctor, but it is rarely the one we expect. He stood, buttoning his tailored coat with practiced precision. Come, Mr. Graves, he called to his assistant. We are leaving. And where shall we be going, sir? Graves inquired with his usual composure. To a quiet town, with a very loud secret, Durant replied. To hunt a creature with many heads. A creature, sir? Graves asked, arching an eyebrow. Durant allowed himself a small smile. One far more dangerous than anything of flesh and blood. A beast made of whispers, of glances exchanged behind lace curtains, of knowing smirks at the grocer's counter. He met Hale's exhausted gaze. Gossip, Doctor. A monster that, if not stopped, devours men whole. There is nothing more elusive, more insidious, than the origins of a rumor. It slithers through the cracks of conversation, feeding on half-truths, stretching itself into something darker, more dangerous. Alistair Durant knew this well. He did not stay at Dr. Hale's home, but instead took up residence at a modest inn in the heart of town, a place where whispers lived in the space between cups of tea and exchanged glances. The morning after his arrival, he met with Claire Moncrief. She was striking, tall, with copper-red hair that caught the light like embers, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to weigh every word before it was spoken. There was a guardedness about her, a readiness, as if she had spent far too long bracing herself for accusations. So Jonathan actually went to you, she said, her tone void of surprise, her arms crossed tight over her chest. I knew he was considering it. You do not approve, Durant observed. Her eyes flickered, but she did not deny it. What can you possibly do? She asked flatly. Durant's voice was soft but sure. There may be a way to deal with this. A hollow laugh escaped her lips. And what exactly is that? She asked. Do you plan to march through the streets and lecture the gossiping wives? Perhaps gather them in the town square and scold them like schoolchildren? Her voice sharpened. Do you think that would stop them? Durant remained silent. watching as the mask she wore began to crack, revealing the frustration, the exhaustion beneath. "They don't accuse outright," she continued, her voice low, tight. "They don't come up to me and say, 'Oh, Claire, did you kill Mrs. Hale so you could have him for yourself?' No, that would be too easy." Her hands clenched into fists. Instead they smile. They lower their voices, just enough so you can almost hear them. "Oh, of course, I don't believe those awful stories about Dr. Hale," they say. "He was a little distant with his wife, perhaps, but that doesn't mean anything. And Claire, oh, she's such a bright young woman. It's natural he'd rely on her so much. I mean, what else was he supposed to do? His wife was an invalid, after all." She let out a sharp breath, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Durant studied her, his sharp eyes catching the tremor in her hands before she forced them still. "You seem to know precisely what is being said," he murmured. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Wouldn't you if you were in my place?" Durant tilted his head slightly, considering her. Then, very softly, he said, "Tell me, Miss Moncrief, do you fear the rumors because they are false, or because they are true?" For the first time she hesitated. It was the smallest thing, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a sharp intake of breath before she caught herself, but it was enough. Durant smiled, just slightly. The game had begun. Jean Moncrief's lips curled in a bitter smile. "Oh, I know exactly what they're saying." Her voice was sharp, laced with resentment. "And what is your grand solution, Mr. Durant? How do you plan to silence an entire town's appetite for scandal?" "The best thing for him to do is sell his practice and start over somewhere else," she said coldly, crossing her arms. Durant studied her. "And you think the story won't follow him?" She shrugged. "That's his risk to take." For a moment there was silence, thick with unspoken truths. Then Durant leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Miss Moncrief, are you going to marry Dr. Hale?" Her expression didn't change, nor did she show any surprise at the question. Instead she replied curtly, "He hasn't asked me." "Why not?" Her blue eyes flickered, barely perceptible before she answered, "Because I've stopped him from doing it." Durant nodded, a small knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Refreshing," he murmured, "to meet someone unafraid of the truth. And why exactly have you stopped him?" Jean exhaled sharply. "Because as soon as I realized people were whispering that he killed his wife to be with me, I knew that if we actually married, it would be seen as proof. I thought maybe if there was no possibility of marriage, the gossip would die." Her voice was filled with frustration. "But it hasn't." "No," Durant agreed. "It hasn't. Curious, isn't it?" She let out a humorless laugh. "Not really. They don't have much else to do in this town." Durant's gaze was steady. "Do you want to marry Dr. Hale?" Jean didn't flinch. "Yes, I knew I did almost from the moment I met him." Durant's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. "Then his wife's death was convenient for you." Jean's smile was razor-sharp. "Mrs. Hale was an insufferable woman. Frankly, I was relieved when she died." Durant chuckled softly. "Ah, Miss Moncrief, your honesty is almost unsettling." Her smirk didn't waver. "I've never seen the point in pretending." He studied her for a long moment, then said, "I have a suggestion." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "Drastic measures are needed," he said slowly. "If you truly want this scandal to end, someone, perhaps yourself, should write to the Home Office." She stiffened. "What are you suggesting?" Durant's voice was quiet, deliberate. "That the only way to end this once and for all is to have the body exhumed." For the first time Jean's confidence flickered. Durant saw it, and he knew this was where the real story began. Jean Moncrief took a step back, her breath catching slightly, her lips parted as if to speak, then pressed shut. Durant watched her closely. "Well, mademoiselle," he murmured. Jean's voice was quiet but firm. "I don't agree with you." He tilted his head. "Why not? Surely a verdict of death from natural causes would silence every last whisper. If that's the verdict you get." Durant leaned forward slightly. "You know what you're implying." Jean let out a sharp breath. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm saying. You're thinking of arsenic, aren't you? That would be easy to detect. But what about the vegetable alkaloids? They degrade over time. After a year there might be no trace left at all. And I know how these so-called expert analysts work. They could return an inconclusive verdict, something vague, no definitive cause of death, and then the rumors would explode. Durant considered her words, fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his chair. Then in a casual tone, he asked, "Who, in your opinion, is the most relentless gossip in this village?" Jean hesitated, then sighed. "Miss Leathern. She's the worst of them all." Ah, Durant's lips curled slightly. "Would it be possible for you to introduce me to this, Miss Leathern?" Jean's smile was bitter. "Nothing could be easier. The old busybodies are all out doing their morning errands. We only have to walk down the main street." As Jean predicted, the opportunity presented itself almost instantly. Outside the post office, they encountered a tall, thin woman with a pointed nose and sharp bird-like eyes that gleamed with perpetual curiosity. Jean stopped, forcing a polite smile. "Good morning, Miss Leathern." "Good morning, Jean." The woman's gaze flickered over her companion, assessing him with unconcealed interest. "Lovely weather, isn't it?" Jean turned slightly. "Let me introduce Mr. Durant. He's staying in the village for a few days." Durant gave a polite nod, taking in the woman's calculating expression. Later, seated in a tea room, he balanced a delicate cup of tea on his knee, listening intently as Miss Leathern's voice rose and fell, weaving a tapestry of half-truths, exaggerations, and insinuations. He let her talk, let her feel as though she was in control of the conversation, but all the while, he was watching, studying, because buried within the village's endless whispers was the one truth no one dared to say aloud, and he was going to find it. Durant sat back in the high-backed chair, cradling a delicate porcelain teacup, his expression one of polite interest. Across from him, Miss Leathern, flattered and expectant, leaned in ever so slightly, her fingers tightening around her own teacup. She had been more than gracious in inviting him to tea, but he knew the invitation had been extended for one reason only. She wanted information. For some time he deflected her inquiries with smooth charm, feeding her just enough to keep her curiosity piqued. Then, when he sensed she was at the brink of frustration, he allowed a shift in his demeanor, a glance over his shoulder, a pause, then a conspiratorial lean forward. "Ah, Miss Leathern," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can see you are far too perceptive for me. You have guessed my secret." He lowered his cup and exhaled, as if reluctant to continue. "Very well, I shall trust you. But you must promise absolute discretion." Miss Leathern's eyes gleamed, her breath quickening. "Oh, of course, Mr. Durant. You can trust me implicitly." He hesitated a beat, before delivering the final carefully measured blow. "I am here," he said, his voice weighted with significance, "at the request of the Home Office." A sharp intake of breath, a flicker of barely contained excitement. "The Home Office," she echoed, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "You don't mean," she swallowed, "not poor Mrs. Aldridge?" Durant nodded slowly, watching her reaction with the detachment of a scientist, observing a specimen under glass. Miss Leathern exhaled the single word, "Well," imbued with layers of meaning, shock, glee, horror, anticipation. "It is," Durant continued, "a delicate matter. I have been asked to determine whether there is sufficient cause for." He allowed another pause, then finished softly, "Exhumation." Miss Leathern gasped, pressing a hand to her throat. "Dig her up." My goodness, how terrible. But Durant caught it, the flicker in her eyes, the faintest upturn at the corner of her lips. "Not terrible, thrilling." "What is your own opinion, Miss Leathern?" he asked, watching her closely. She hesitated, performing the role of the reluctant informant. "Well, of course, there has been talk." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Not that I listen to gossip, mind you, but one hears things. Dr. Aldridge has behaved, let's say, rather peculiarly since the incident, but as I always say, that needn't mean anything. Grief can manifest in all sorts of ways." Durant nodded encouragingly. Miss Leathern's voice softened, took on a confidential edge. "But between you and me, there is something I do know for certain. Dr. Aldridge and his wife, well, Their marriage wasn't what you'd call affectionate. She sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving his. That much I can confirm on the best authority. Nurse Harrington, who cared for Mrs. Aldridge right up until the end, confided as much to me herself. Durant set down his cup, a slow smile forming. Now at last, they were getting somewhere. Durant let Miss Leathen's words spill out, her excitement barely masked by feigned reluctance. Her sharp nose twitched, her eyes gleaming as she spoke, punctuating her sentences with quick little nods, as if affirming her own insights. Of course Nurse Harrington had her suspicions. She never outright said anything, but one can tell, can't one? It's in the way people speak, the way they avoid certain topics. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a dramatic whisper. But if the body were exhumed, well, then we'd know for certain, wouldn't we? Durant tilted his head slightly, an expression of mild sympathy on his face. Yes, he said gently, then we would know. Miss Leathen inhaled sharply, as though the very thought of it sent shivers down her spine, but Durant could see the thrill dancing in her eyes. There have been cases like it before, of course. Armstrong, for one, and that other man, oh I forget his name, and then there was Crippen, naturally. She paused, her lips tightening. I always did wonder whether Ethel was in on it or not. Durant remained silent, his gaze patient, expectant. He knew the trick. Say too much, and people pull back. Say too little, and they fill the silence themselves. Sure enough, she continued. Now Jean Monraith, she's a charming girl, no doubt. But I wouldn't say she led him on, exactly, though men do get rather foolish over young women, don't they? And she and Dr. Aldridge were certainly thrown together, quite a bit. Durant suppressed a smile as he silently counted how many times she had uttered the phrase of course. It was a pattern, a way of absolving herself from blame. If everything was obvious, then she was merely stating the facts, wasn't she? And naturally, she continued, her voice tinged with the satisfaction of someone unraveling a grand mystery. With an exhumation, there's bound to be more that comes out. Servants, for instance. Oh, servants always know far more than they let on, don't they? They gossip terribly, one simply can't prevent it. And it was strange, don't you think, that Dr. Aldridge dismissed Beatrice almost immediately after the funeral? And in times like these, when it's so difficult to find good help, no, I always thought that was rather suspicious. As though he was afraid she might know something. Durant let his gaze darken just slightly. It certainly seems as though there are grounds for inquiry, he said, his tone measured, solemn. Miss Leathen gave a little theatrical shudder, pressing a hand to her chest. Oh, but one does so shrink from the idea, she murmured. Our dear quiet little village, dragged through the newspapers, the publicity. She shook her head, lips pursed. Durant watched her, then asked, ever so softly, it appalls you? Miss Leathen hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then she sighed dramatically. Well, it's just such a shame, isn't it? And Durant knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she would be the first to read every scandalous detail in the morning paper. Miss Leathen hesitated, her fingers tapping lightly against the porcelain rim of her teacup. It does a little, she admitted, casting a quick glance toward the window as though fearing unseen ears might be pressed against the glass. I'm old-fashioned, you know, and as you say, it's probably nothing but gossip. Durant nodded slowly, his expression one of sympathetic understanding, but he said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to fill it. She did not disappoint. Well, she continued hesitantly, her voice dropping slightly, I wouldn't like to say so with absolute certainty, but you do know what they say, there's no smoke without fire. I was thinking the same thing myself, Durant murmured, watching her reaction closely. She exhaled as if relieved to hear him confirm her suspicions. It's all terribly unfortunate, isn't it? She sighed. Durant rose smoothly from his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves before offering her a slight bow. I can trust your discretion, mademoiselle. Miss Leathen placed a hand to her chest, as if the very idea of breaking such confidence wounded her. Oh, of course, Monsieur Durant, you have my absolute word. He smiled, a small knowing curve of the lips, and took his leave. The little maid, Gladys, stood by the door, holding his coat and hat with the rigid attentiveness of someone eager to listen in but too afraid to show it outright. Durant accepted his belongings. Then, with an almost casual air, he leaned in just slightly. "I am here to inquire into the circumstances of Mrs. Oldfield's death," he said, his voice low and measured, "but I would be most obliged if you would keep that strictly to yourself." The effect was immediate. Gladys' eyes widened so drastically that she nearly stumbled backward into the umbrella stand. She clutched the fabric of her apron with both hands, her breath catching in her throat. "Oh, sir," she gasped, barely able to contain her excitement. "Then the doctor did do her in, didn't he?" Durant arched an eyebrow. "You've thought so for some time, haven't you?" "Well, sir, it wasn't just me," she stammered, lowering her voice to an urgent whisper. "It was Beatrice. She was up there when Mrs. Oldfield passed, and she always said—" Gladys hesitated, then nodded fervently. "She always said she thought there'd been foul play." Durant tilted his head slightly, observing her. "Foul play," he echoed, deliberately choosing the more dramatic phrasing to keep her talking. Gladys nodded again, her excitement barely contained. "Yes, sir, and she wasn't the only one. Nurse Harrison thought so too. She was ever so fond of Mrs. Oldfield. She was absolutely heartbroken when she passed, and afterward." Gladys hesitated for effect, lowering her voice even further. She turned right against the doctor. "Wouldn't so much as speak a word to him after the funeral, and she wouldn't have done that unless she knew something, would she?" Durant's eyes glinted with interest. "And where is Nurse Harrison now?" Gladys' response came swiftly, eager to be helpful. "She's looking after old Miss Bristow, down at the end of the village. You can't miss it. It's got pillars and a big porch, real grand looking." Durant inclined his head slightly in thanks. "Much obliged, Gladys." He turned away, but as he stepped onto the cobbled street, his expression shifted. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but something still didn't sit quite right. If Nurse Harrison had suspicions, then she, more than anyone, would know the truth. A short walk later, Durant found himself sitting across from the woman who must have seen more than anyone else. Nurse Harrison was not what he had expected. She was a woman nearing 40, yet still strikingly handsome, with the composed, serene features of a Madonna. Dark eyes, large and sympathetic, watched him carefully as he explained his purpose. She did not interrupt, nor did she display any immediate reaction. Instead, she listened with an almost unnerving patience. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but deliberate. "You want to know about Mrs. Oldfield's death?" Durant nodded, but said nothing, waiting. Nurse Harrison exhaled softly, folding her hands in her lap. "Then I suppose," she said slowly, "we should begin with the truth." Nurse Harrison's fingers twisted together in her lap, her expression tightening with visible discomfort. She took a slow breath, shaking her head as if willing away an unseen weight. "Yes, I know," she murmured, her voice low but firm. "I know there are unpleasant stories going around. I've done what I could to stop them, but it's hopeless." She exhaled sharply, her gaze flickering toward the window, as if she half expected to see shadowy figures lurking just outside. "People like the excitement, you know, a scandal, a mystery. It gives them something to talk about." Durant watched her intently. "But there must have been something that started the rumors." For a moment Nurse Harrison said nothing, but Durant didn't miss the way her hands clenched, just a little tighter, the way her expression darkened, as though an invisible force pressed down on her shoulders. She shook her head again, but this time, her hesitation betrayed her. "Perhaps," he suggested smoothly, "Dr. Oldfield and his wife were not getting along. That might have been enough to spark whispers." The nurse's response came swiftly, her tone almost defensive. "Oh no," she said with certainty. "Dr. Oldfield was always extremely kind and patient with his wife. He was very fond of her." Durant caught the flicker of uncertainty in her words. He tilted his head. "You hesitate," he noted. A faint flush crept up her cheeks. "I wouldn't quite say they had a loving marriage," she admitted. "Mrs. Oldfield was difficult, not an easy woman to please. She constantly demanded sympathy, attention." Her voice softened, as though she regretted speaking ill of the dead. Not all of it was justified. Durant's voice was gentle but probing. "You mean she exaggerated her condition?" The nurse nodded, a tight motion of agreement. "Yes, her health issues were largely of her own imagining. There was always something new, some ache, some pain, some terrible affliction that required constant care. And yet, Durant said gravely, she died. A shadow passed over Nurse Harrison's face. I know, she whispered, almost to herself. I know. Durant let the silence settle between them, watching the way her hands trembled ever so slightly, the way her brows knitted together in troubled uncertainty. Then quietly, he said, I think you do know what first gave rise to all these stories. Nurse Harrison's lips parted slightly, as if to protest, but no words came. A moment later, a faint flush of guilt or unease colored her cheeks. Well, she said at last, I could perhaps make a guess. She hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as though speaking too loudly might summon something dark and unspoken into the room. I believe it was Beatrice, the maid, who first started these rumors, and I think I know what put the idea into her head. Durant's gaze sharpened. Yes, the nurse inhaled slowly. It was something I happened to overhear, she admitted, a scrap of conversation between Dr. Oldfield and Miss Monrief. Durant did not move, but inside his mind clicked into place. Jean Monrief, he repeated, and you believe Beatrice overheard it as well? I'm certain of it, Nurse Harrison said firmly. Only I doubt she would ever admit to it. What was this conversation? The nurse fell silent, her brows furrowing as if reaching back through the corridors of memory to retrieve something precise, something undeniable. Then finally she spoke. It was about 3 weeks before Mrs. Oldfield's final attack, she said slowly. I was coming down the stairs. Dr. Oldfield and Jean Monrief were in the dining room. They had no idea I was there. I paused just for a moment, and that's when I heard her say. She broke off, pressing her lips together. Durant remained perfectly still. What did she say? Nurse Harrison's voice was barely above a whisper. She said, how much longer will it be? I can't bear to wait much longer. Durant's breath stilled. And Dr. Oldfield, he prompted. The nurse swallowed, he answered her, just as softly. Not much longer now, darling. I swear it. There was a beat of silence before she continued. Then she said again, I can't bear this waiting. You do think it will be all right, don't you? Durant's fingers curled slightly at his side, and his response, a terrible finality filled Nurse Harrison's expression. He said, of course, nothing can go wrong. A cold, heavy silence settled in the room. Durant's mind worked swiftly, the words, the tone, the weight behind them. If Beatrice had overheard it too, it was no wonder the rumors had taken root like poison seeping into the very bones of the village. Because those words, those quiet, intimate reassurances, sounded less like comfort between lovers and more like a promise of something already set into motion, something irreversible, something deadly. Nurse Harrison hesitated, her fingers curling slightly as though gripping an invisible thread of memory. Then, with a deep breath, she continued, her voice carrying the weight of something long buried. This time next year we'll be married. She paused, glancing at Durant as if measuring his reaction. That was the very first inkling I had, Monsieur Durant, that there was anything more than friendship between Dr. Oldfield and Miss Monrief. Of course I knew he admired her. I mean, everyone did. She was young, vibrant, always smiling, but I had never suspected anything deeper. That moment, though, it caught me off guard. I had been about to step into the room, but instead I turned and went quietly back up the stairs. It had given me quite a shock. Durant said nothing, only watched her carefully, allowing the silence to stretch between them like a thread waiting to snap. Nurse Harrison wet her lips, eyes flicking toward the window, perhaps instinctively checking for unseen listeners. Then she continued, her voice lower now, almost confessional. I did notice something else, she admitted. The kitchen door was slightly open. It wasn't until later, after all the rumors started, that I realized Beatrice must have been listening. Durant's brows lifted slightly. And you believe she misunderstood what she heard? You can see how easily that could happen, can't you? Nurse Harrison asked, leaning forward slightly. The way they were speaking, if you only caught fragments of it, it could be taken two ways. Dr. Oldfield might have simply meant that he knew his wife was very ill, that she didn't have much longer to live, and I have no doubt that's what he meant. but to someone like Beatrice, she shook her head. To Beatrice, it might have sounded different. It might have sounded as though the doctor and Jean Monriff were making plans, that they were waiting for something, no, for someone to die. The weight of the words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Durant studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. But you, Nurse Harrison, you don't believe that, do you? Her head jerked up, her expression almost indignant. No, of course not. Durant's voice was gentle but unwavering. Are you certain? A flicker of something guilt, fear, crossed her face. She stopped herself. Then with more force she said, there's nothing more to tell. I swear it. Durant tilted his head, observing her reaction with keen interest. Perhaps, he said quietly, but I cannot help but wonder, Nurse Harrison, if there is something you have not yet told me. A flush rose to her cheeks, her composure cracking, just for a second. No, she said sharply. Certainly not. What else could there be? Durant did not answer. He merely watched her, the silence stretching between them again, heavier this time. She looked away first. He let out a slow breath, then almost casually he said, it is possible that the Home Office may order an exhumation of Mrs. Oldfield's body. The reaction was immediate. Nurse Harrison went pale. Oh no, the horror in her voice was unmistakable. Surely not. What a terrible, terrible thing. Durant remained calm. You think it would be unnecessary? I think it would be dreadful, she said vehemently. Think of the scandal. Think of the talk it would create. Poor Dr. Oldfield. He's suffered enough. It would be quite terrible for him. Durant's voice was quiet but firm. You don't think that in the end it might be for the best? She blinked at him, confused. What do you mean? If Dr. Oldfield is innocent, Durant said smoothly, his innocence will be proved. He watched as the thought took root in her mind, saw the shift in her expression, the flicker of doubt, the slow knitting of her brows, the moment of realization. Then slowly her shoulders dropped, and a breath escaped her lips, long and steady. I hadn't thought of that, she admitted, her voice softer now, more certain. Of course, if there is nothing to hide, then it is the only thing to be done. A sudden series of heavy thumps echoed from the ceiling above them. Nurse Harrison jolted in her seat, then immediately stood. That's Miss Bristow, she said, glancing toward the staircase. She must have woken up from her rest. I need to get her settled before her tea is brought up. Then I'll be stepping out for my evening walk. Durant rose as well, his gaze never leaving her face. Yes, Nurse Harrison, he said quietly. I believe you are quite right. An autopsy will settle the business once and for all. Nurse Harrison murmured, as if convincing herself. It will end the speculation, put all these dreadful rumors to rest, and clear poor Dr. Oldfield's name. She shook hands with Durant hastily, her grip colder than before, and left the room in a hurry. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing fainter with each step. Durant lingered for a moment, staring at the closed door, his mind working rapidly. Then with a decisive nod, he straightened his coat, and made his way down the quiet village street toward the post office. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and old brick, as if the village itself held its breath. At the post office, he stepped into the dimly lit interior, where the scent of paper, ink and dust filled the air. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and pursed lips eyed him curiously. Durant leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth. Madam, might you know where the maid, who formerly worked for Dr. Oldfield, Beatrice, I believe, resides now? The postmistress narrowed her eyes thoughtfully, drumming her fingers against the wooden counter. Beatrice King. Aye, she's been in 2 houses since leaving Dr. Oldfield's. She's working for Mrs. Marley over the bank now. Durant nodded in appreciation. Thank you. As he made a small purchase, a book of stamps, 2 postcards, and a piece of local pottery, he casually steered the conversation toward Mrs. Oldfield's death. The reaction was immediate. A flicker of something passed across the postmistress's face, wiriness perhaps, or something more cunning. She hesitated, then said in a lower voice, very sudden, wasn't it? Lots of talk in the village, as you might have heard. Durant feigned mild curiosity. Oh, talk of what sort? The woman leaned in slightly, her voice dropping further. Maybe that's why you want to see Beatrice King. Folks always thought it odd, the way she was sent away so quickly, like someone didn't want her talking too much, and maybe, just maybe, she knew something. She's been known to drop a hint or two, mind you. Durant filed this away, offering her a pleasant smile before stepping back out into the street. The information was interesting, but it was Beatrice herself who might hold the key. He found her later that afternoon, in a cramped little servants' quarters above Mrs. Marley's grand old house. Beatrice King was a short, round-faced girl with small darting eyes that belied her otherwise stolid expression. Her demeanor was one of dull stupidity, but Durant wasn't fooled. There was something sharper beneath the surface. Still, she was careful, too careful. "I don't know nothing about anything," she said firmly, folding her arms. "It ain't for me to say what went on up there." Durant studied her, noting the way she avoided his gaze, her fingers twitching ever so slightly. "You must have some idea," he said, keeping his tone light. "Rumors don't start from nowhere, do they?" Beatrice sniffed. "People see what they want to see, don't they? Hear what they want to hear. I ain't got nothing to do with it." He tilted his head. No one mentioned overhearing a conversation between the doctor and Miss Moncrief. Her reaction was subtle but telling, a momentary flicker in her expression, a hesitation that might have gone unnoticed by a less experienced observer. "I ain't one to go listening at doors," she said quickly. Too quickly. "And you've no right saying I did." Durant let the silence stretch between them, watching her squirm under the weight of it. "I never said you did, Miss King." She pressed her lips together, stubborn as ever. Durant smiled slightly. "I think you know more than you're letting on." Beatrice's face darkened, her fingers twitching at the edge of her apron, but still, she said nothing. Durant sighed, stepping back. "Very well, if you remember anything at all, you know where to find me." He turned to leave, but just as he reached the door he heard it, the softest intake of breath, barely audible, but enough to make him pause. A hesitation, a moment of indecision, and then ever so quietly, Beatrice muttered, maybe some folks get what's coming to them." Durant turned slowly. "What do you mean by that?" But Beatrice clammed up again, her mouth a thin, stubborn line. Durant gave her a long, thoughtful look before stepping out into the cool evening air. Yes, he thought. She knew something, and sooner or later, she'd talk. Ever heard of poisoning by arsenic? A flicker of something, quick, furtive, calculating, flashed across Beatrice King's otherwise sullen face. Her lips parted, but for a moment she hesitated, her fingers curling into the fabric of her apron. Then cautiously, she said, "So that's what it was, in the medicine bottle." Durant's eyes sharpened. "What medicine bottle?" Beatrice sniffed, tilting her head slightly, as though weighing the consequences of speaking. Then with a sudden air of defiance, she said, "One of the bottles of medicine, the ones Miss Moncrief used to mix up for the missus. Nurse was all upset about it. I could tell. She tasted it, smelled it, and then poured it away down the sink. I saw her. Then she filled the bottle up with plain water from the tap. The medicine was white, clear, like water, so no one would have noticed the difference." Durant leaned forward, and this happened more than once. Beatrice nodded, now seemingly lost in thought, her expression troubled. "Aye, and then there was that time when Miss Moncrief took up a pot of tea to the missus. Nurse brought it straight back down, and made a fresh one, said it hadn't been made with boiling water, but I dunno, I always thought that was just the sort of fussing way nurses have." She hesitated, then added in a hushed voice, "Now I'm not so sure, maybe it was more than that." Durant studied her carefully, reading between the lines. "Did you like Miss Moncrief, Beatrice?" Beatrice shrugged, didn't mind her, bit standoffish. "Always thought she was sweet on the doctor though, you only had to see the way she looked at him." Durant nodded slowly. That was precisely what he had suspected. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, each clue sliding neatly into place. He rose from his seat, fastening the buttons of his coat. "Thank you, Miss King. You've been very helpful." Later that evening, in the dimly lit confines of the village inn, Durant gave his instructions to George, his ever-reliable assistant. Dr. Alan Garcia, the Home Office analyst, listened with an amused twinkle in his eye. He was a man who thrived on the thrill of discovery, and now as he rubbed his hands together, he regarded Durant with an almost playful admiration. "Well, well, this suits you, doesn't it, Durant?" Garcia chuckled. "The man who's always right." Durant merely inclined his head. "You flatter me. What put you onto it?" Garcia asked, sipping his brandy. Durant gave a small knowing smile. "Gossip." Garcia raised an eyebrow. "As they say," Durant continued, "rumor is a fire, and in a town like this it spreads fast." The following day, Market Loughborough was buzzing like a beehive. The town had murmured and speculated ever since the exhumation proceedings were announced. But now that the findings of the autopsy had begun to leak, excitement had reached a fever pitch. Whispers ran through the streets, faces pressed together in hurried urgent discussions. Durant, unfazed by the storm of speculation, sat at the inn, finishing a hearty meal of steak and kidney pudding, washing it down with a glass of beer. The weight of his thoughts rested heavily in his mind, though outwardly he appeared composed. Then a message was brought to him. A lady was waiting to see him. It was Nurse Harrison. She entered the room as if pulled by an unseen force, her face pale, her hands trembling. The dark circles beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "Is it true?" she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this really true, Mr. Durant?" Durant stood slowly, offering her a steady look. He gestured toward a chair, easing her into it with a reassuring touch. "Yes," he said quietly. "More than enough arsenic to cause death was found." Nurse Harrison let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She shook her head violently, her breathing ragged. "I never thought," her voice broke. "I never." For one moment, her words trailed off into silence, and for the first time, Durant saw something in her eyes. Not just shock, not just disbelief, guilt. Something twisted deep in her conscience, something she hadn't told him yet. Durant sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "Nurse Harrison," he said gently, but firmly, "there's something else, isn't there?" Her breath hitched. He waited, and in the tense, suffocating silence of the small inn room, Durant knew the truth was about to come out. Nurse Harrison let out a choked sob, burying her face in her trembling hands. The weight of the truth, long avoided, had finally crashed over her like a tidal wave. Poirot, calm, composed, watched her with keen eyes. He let the moment settle, let her feel the enormity of what she had just learned. Then in a voice so gentle it barely rose above a whisper, he said, "The truth had to come out, you know." She lifted her tear-streaked face, her lips quivering. "Will they hang him?" Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "A great deal must still be proved, mademoiselle. There is opportunity to consider, access to poison, the vehicle in which it was administered. Until these matters are clear, nothing is certain." Nurse Harrison shuddered. "But suppose, Mr. Poirot, suppose he had nothing to do with it, nothing at all." Poirot gave a small delicate shrug. "In that case, he will be acquitted." For a moment she stared into the distance, silent. Then she inhaled sharply, as though making a decision. "There is something," her voice trembled, "something I suppose I ought to have told you before, but I didn't think it mattered. I didn't think there was really anything in it. It just seemed odd." Poirot leaned in slightly, his gaze, steady and patient, never wavered. "I knew there was something," he said softly. "Tell me now." She swallowed hard. "It isn't much, it probably means nothing, but one day, I went down to the dispensary for something, and I saw Jean Monref doing something rather strange." "Yes," Poirot prompted, his voice smooth as silk. Nurse Harrison hesitated. "It sounds silly, but she was filling up her powder compact, a pink enamel one." Poirot's expression did not change. "Yes, she wasn't filling it with powder." The words came out in a rush, as though she had to force them past her lips. "Not face powder, I mean. She was tipping something into it from one of the bottles, and not just any bottle, one from the poison cupboard." A slow creeping silence filled the room. Poirot did not blink. "When she saw me," Nurse Harrison continued, her voice lower now, almost a whisper, "she started, slammed the compact shut, stuffed it into her handbag, and she put the bottle back into the cupboard so fast that I couldn't see what it was." Her breath came in shaky gulps. "I didn't think anything of it then, but now that I know, now that Mrs. Oldfield really was poisoned." She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth. Poirot exhaled slowly, rising to his feet with deliberate ease. "You will excuse me," he murmured. Without another word, he left the room. Moments later, he stood at a telephone, dialing with swift precision. His voice, though measured, held the unmistakable note of urgency. "Detective Sergeant Gray, Berkshire Police." The line crackled. "Speaking." Poirot's voice dropped. "There is a matter that requires your immediate attention." By the time he returned to Nurse Harrison, the room had fallen into a thick silence. She sat stiffly in her chair, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Poirot sank into his seat, saying nothing at first. His mind was elsewhere. He was seeing a woman's face, a face framed by red hair, a face with bright, determined eyes, and a firm mouth, and he was hearing her voice, clear and unyielding, from a conversation past. "I don't agree." Jen Monref had not wanted an autopsy. She had given her reasons, plausible ones certainly, but the fact remained: she was competent, efficient, resolute, and in love. In love with a man who was bound to a sickly, complaining wife. A wife who, according to Nurse Harrison, could have lived for years. A wife who, for someone like Jen Monref, would always be in the way. Poirot steepled his fingers, his mind weaving the final pieces together. Jen Monref, he murmured to himself. And he knew. The truth was waiting. And it was about to be revealed. Nurse Harrison sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly together in her lap. Her face had lost all color, and her breath was shallow. Poirot, standing near the window, let out a long, weary sigh. His expression was unreadable, his gaze distant. "What are you thinking of?" Nurse Harrison asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot turned, his dark eyes resting on her with an almost sorrowful intensity. "The pity of things, mademoiselle, the great, tragic pity of things." She swallowed hard. I don't believe for a moment that he knew anything about it. Poirot's lips curved slightly, a fleeting, almost gentle smile. "Non, I am quite certain he did not." The door creaked open, breaking the heavy silence. Detective Sergeant Gray entered the room, his face grim, his movements careful. In his gloved hands, he held a small object wrapped in a delicate silk handkerchief. Slowly, deliberately, he unfolded the fabric and placed the item on the table, a bright rose-pink enamel compact. Nurse Harrison gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth as her wide, fearful eyes fixed on the object. "That's the one," she whispered. "That's the one I saw." Sergeant Gray gave a short nod. "Found it pushed right to the back of Miss Monref's bureau drawer," he said, "hidden inside a handkerchief sachet." He turned to Poirot. "No visible fingerprints, but we'll handle it carefully." Using the edge of the handkerchief, Gray pressed the spring clasp. The compact clicked open. Inside, instead of the usual soft, perfumed powder, there was something else, something far more sinister. "This isn't face powder," Gray murmured. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before dipping a careful fingertip into the substance. Lifting it to his tongue, he tasted the faintest trace, his expression darkening. "No particular taste." Poirot's voice was quiet. "White arsenic does not taste." The room seemed to shrink in that moment, the air thick with an unspoken horror. Gray exhaled sharply. "It'll be analyzed at once." He turned his gaze to Nurse Harrison. "Can you swear to this being the same compact you saw Miss Monref with, in the dispensary?" Nurse Harrison's mouth opened, then closed. She hesitated, but then summoning her courage, she nodded firmly. "Yes, I'm positive. That's the exact one." Sergeant Gray sighed. He turned toward Poirot and gave a slow, knowing nod. Poirot, without missing a beat, stepped to the side and rang the bell. His manner was unhurried, as though he were merely ordering tea. A few moments later the door opened, and George, Poirot's impeccable valet, entered. He stood at attention, his demeanor as unshakable as ever. Poirot gestured toward the compact. "Miss Harrison has identified this powder compact as one she saw in the possession of Miss Monref over a year ago." He let the statement hang for a moment before continuing. "Would you be surprised to learn, mademoiselle, that this particular compact was sold by Messrs. Woolworth only a few weeks ago, and that this exact design and color has only been in manufacture for the last 3 months. A strangled sound escaped Nurse Harrison's lips. She stared at Poirot in disbelief. What are you saying? Poirot's expression remained impassive. He turned to George. Have you seen this compact before, mon ami? George took a step forward. His voice, as always, was calm and precise. Yes, sir. I observed this lady. He inclined his head slightly toward Nurse Harrison. Purchase it at Woolworth's on Friday the 18th. The silence in the room was deafening. George continued, unwavering. Pursuant to your instructions, sir, I followed this lady whenever she went out. On the day in question, she took a bus over to Darnington and purchased this compact. She then returned home with it. Nurse Harrison's hands twitched slightly in her lap. George was not finished. Later the same day, she went to the house where Miss Monref lodges. Acting on your orders, sir, I was already inside the house. His voice remained neutral, clinical. I observed her enter Miss Monref's bedroom. She opened the bureau drawer and placed this compact inside, pushing it far to the back. I had a clear view through the narrow gap in the door. He paused, his gaze resting on Nurse Harrison. She then left, believing herself unobserved. A terrible silence followed. Poirot, his eyes never leaving Nurse Harrison's face, finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost kind. It is unfortunate, mademoiselle. No one locks their doors in a quiet little town like this. Nurse Harrison sat frozen, her breathing uneven. She blinked rapidly, as though trying to will away the walls closing in around her. No, she whispered. No, this isn't, Poirot sighed. You planted it, he said simply. You wanted it to be found. You wanted Jean Monref to be guilty. She let out a shaky breath. I had to make sure. Poirot held up a hand, silencing her. There is no need, mademoiselle. His voice was tinged with sadness. It is over. As Detective Sergeant Grey stepped forward, the compact still resting open on the table, the truth settled like a final, inescapable weight, and Nurse Harrison, the trembling, pitiful woman before them, could do nothing but bow her head and weep. The room was thick with silence, save for the distant ticking of the clock on the mantel. The weight of the truth, now fully unraveled, hung heavy in the dimly lit space. Poirot's eyes, dark and sharp, bore into Nurse Harrison with a quiet, almost venomous intensity. His voice when he spoke was no longer gentle, it was laced with steel. Can you explain these facts, Nurse Harrison? A pause. I think not. She was trembling now, her hands cold and clammy against the fabric of her skirt. A single tear slid down her cheek, but there was no fight left in her, no desperate attempt to deny the inevitable. There was no arsenic in that box when it left Messrs. Woolworth. Poirot continued, his voice quiet, relentless, but there was when it left Miss Bristow's house. He tilted his head slightly, his expression almost pitying. It was unwise of you to keep a supply of arsenic in your possession, mademoiselle. A strangled sound escaped her lips. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands against them, as though to block out the suffocating truth. Then in a voice hollow and lifeless, she spoke. It's true, she whispered. It's all true. She swallowed hard, forcing the words past her dry throat. I killed her, and all for nothing, nothing. Her shoulders shook with a humorless, broken laugh. I was mad. For a long moment, no one spoke. Poirot simply observed her, his expression unreadable. He had seen this before, the moment when guilt could no longer be outrun, the moment when the mind, after struggling against itself for so long, finally collapsed under the weight of its own deception. Then from the corner of the room, another voice broke the silence. I must ask you to forgive me, Monsieur Poirot. Jean Monref stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her voice, usually so firm, so controlled, wavered with something close to shame. I have been so angry with you, so terribly angry. It seemed to me that you were making everything worse, spinning suspicion where there was none. She hesitated, shaking her head. But I was wrong, wasn't I? Poirot regarded her for a moment before offering a small knowing smile. But you see, mademoiselle, that is the way of things, is it not? At first the search for truth only seems to multiply the chaos. It is like the legend of the Lernean Hydra. Every time a head is cut off, two more grow in its place. Rumors like those heads spread and multiply, feeding on fear, on anger, on doubt. He turned slightly, his gaze flickering toward Nurse Harrison, who now sat motionless staring at the floor. But, Poirot continued, his voice quieter now, just as my namesake, the great Hercules, did not rest until he reached the first, the original head, so too was it my task to find the source of this rumor. Jean's breath caught, and the source was Nurse Harrison. Silence. Poirot exhaled, almost wearily. It did not take me long to see it. From the moment she spoke, she made a mistake, a small one, but a mistake nonetheless. She repeated to me a conversation she claimed to have overheard it between you and Dr. Oldfield. He tilted his head, watching her reaction carefully. And yet that conversation was all wrong. Jean frowned, confused. Wrong? It was psychologically impossible. Poirot tapped his temple lightly. You and the doctor are both intelligent, level-headed people. If you had truly plotted to kill Mrs. Oldfield together, you would never have had such a conversation in an open room, where anyone on the stairs or in the kitchen might overhear. No, such a conversation belonged in fiction, not in life. And more than that, the words themselves were wrong. He let the statement settle before adding, they were not the words of you, mademoiselle, nor were they the words of Dr. Oldfield. They were the words of someone else entirely. He turned his gaze fully to Nurse Harrison, who sat still as stone. They were the words of a woman like Nurse Harrison, a woman of her age, her temperament. They were the words she would imagine herself saying, in a moment like that. Jean's breath caught in her throat. Poirot folded his hands behind his back, pacing slowly. At first I believed it was merely a case of jealousy, a lie, born out of spite. Nurse Harrison had worked closely with Dr. Oldfield for 3 years. He had trusted her, relied on her. She in turn had built her own dreams upon that foundation. She thought perhaps that if Mrs. Oldfield were to die, Dr. Oldfield would turn to her, that she would become the woman at his side. He paused, shaking his head. But then, Mrs. Oldfield did die, and instead of proposing to Nurse Harrison, the doctor fell in love with you, Mademoiselle Monrafe. Jean's hand flew to her lips. My God, it was then, Poirot murmured, that the rumor was born. A rumor started not by accident, not by mere misinterpretation, but with intent. A lie, spoken over and over, until it became truth in the minds of those who heard it. He glanced at Nurse Harrison once more. That, I believed, was all it was. A jealous woman, spreading a dangerous rumor. His voice dropped to a whisper. But then, mademoiselle, then came the smoke. Jean frowned. The smoke. Poirot's gaze darkened. Ah yes, the old saying, there is no smoke without fire. He took a step forward, his voice now slow, deliberate. At first I thought the fire was only in her heart. But then I found the arsenic. Jean's blood ran cold, and I realized, Poirot finished, that the fire was real. The weight of his words pressed against the room like a suffocating force. Jean felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Beside her, Nurse Harrison let out a soft, trembling breath. Her fingers curled into fists against her lap. I killed her, she murmured again, and Poirot, his sharp little eyes full of something close to sorrow, simply nodded. Yes, mademoiselle, he said softly. You did. The room was hushed, save for the faint creak of an old chair, and the whisper of breath held too long. Poirot stood motionless, his keen eyes scanning the faces before him, his voice low and measured, cut through the silence like a scalpel. There is no smoke without fire. He let the words hang, his gaze settling on Nurse Harrison, whose face had gone pale, her hands clenching the edge of the chair, as though to steady herself. It recurred to me most significantly. Poirot continued, at first I believed you merely spread a dangerous rumor, but then, mademoiselle, I began to wonder, was that truly all you had done? A sharp intake of breath from Jean Monrafe, a nervous flicker in Dr. Oldfield's eyes. Poirot ignored them. His focus was solely on the woman before him. Certain things you said, he murmured, tilting his head. They rang strangely in my ears. You claimed Mrs. Oldfield's illness was largely imaginary, that she did not truly suffer. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle before adding, and yet, the doctor was in no doubt of her pain. He had seen it firsthand, and when he called another physician before her death, the diagnosis was the same: her condition was grave. But you wished to believe otherwise, did you not? Nurse Harrison shivered, but said nothing. I brought up the idea of an exhumation, tentatively, of course, Poirot continued, and how frightened you were. Ah, but not for long, for in that moment, your jealousy and hatred overpowered your fear. You realized something: if arsenic were found in her body, no one would look at you. The blame would fall on Dr. Oldfield and Mademoiselle Monrafe. And so, rather than cowering in fear, you let the idea grow. You saw it as an opportunity. A strangled sound escaped from Jean's lips. My God. Poirot nodded. There was only one way to make you overreach yourself. If there were even a chance that Jean Monrafe might escape suspicion, I knew you would act, to ensure she did not. And so, I set my trap. I had my most discreet man, George, follow you. You did not know him, and so you did not suspect. And what did he find? His voice lowered, dangerously soft. You sneaking into Miss Monrafe's room. You hiding the compact with poisoned powder at the back of her bureau drawer. A visible shudder went through Nurse Harrison. She looked trapped, her breath shallow. And so Poirot finished, straightening. All ended as it should. Jean Monrafe exhaled shakily. You've been wonderful. Dr. Oldfield, his voice thick with emotion, added, yes, I can never thank you enough. What a blind fool I was. Poirot turned his gaze to Jean, his curiosity piqued. And you, mademoiselle, were you as blind? She hesitated, then spoke slowly, as though unraveling a thought she had long kept buried. I was terribly worried. You see the arsenic in the poison cupboard. It didn't tally. Dr. Oldfield's eyes widened. Jean, you didn't think. No, not you, she interrupted quickly, shaking her head. But I feared that Mrs. Oldfield had somehow taken it herself, that she had been poisoning herself, making herself ill for sympathy, and then had taken too much by mistake. But if an autopsy had been performed, if arsenic had been found, no one would have believed that theory. They would have blamed you. Her voice wavered. That's why I never said anything about the missing arsenic. I even doctored the poison book. Poirot raised a brow, impressed by her cleverness, though his tone remained grave. But the last person I would ever have suspected, Jean whispered, turning toward the woman, who now sat hunched over, shoulders shaking, was Nurse Harrison. Dr. Oldfield swallowed hard. Nor I. She seemed so gentle, so kind, a quiet, caring woman, like a... He hesitated, searching for the word. A Madonna, Poirot supplied softly. Then he sighed. Yes, she might have been. She would have made a good wife, a good mother perhaps. But her emotions, mademoiselle, they were too strong for her. Love twisted into obsession, admiration into jealousy, and jealousy into something far, far worse. He cast one final glance at Nurse Harrison, who now sat motionless, her face buried in her hands. The pity of it, he murmured. But then his gaze shifted, landing upon the figures before him, the weary doctor and the eager-faced woman beside him. And in their eyes, he saw relief. He saw hope. The weight had lifted, and for them at least, the future was bright again. Poirot straightened, allowing himself a small smile. These two, he mused to himself, have stepped out of the shadow and into the sun. And as he turned on his heel, a final thought flickered through his mind, quiet and satisfied. The second labor of Hercules, he murmured. And with that, the great detective walked away, leaving behind a mystery solved and justice restored.